Ken Aletta has been contributing to The New Yorker since 1977.
Yeah, if you and I are still covering media, as long as Ken's been covering media, it will be the year 2060.
I don't know. I would say that I wasn't covering media. I mean, I was covering power.
That's true. If I cover media in 2060, it'll be like whether like the Neuralink hacks are, changing advertising, whether like ad insertions that fully cover your eyes via your brain are ethical, things like that.
I always hope to die young and full of potential, which means I'm kind of running out of time.
You gotta hurry.
I hope to not be doing that in the year 2090 or whatever.
I'm Ben Smith.
I'm Nayeema Raza.
And this is Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media.
So last episode, post-election, we spoke about Hollywood turning away from politics. And this time, we're going to talk about audiences turning away from traditional media. Post-election, is the media irrelevant? Is the business dying? What do you think, Ben?
Always, as long as I've been doing this, the business has been dying, but also feels like time for something new, moment of perhaps rebirth.
I mean, to be fair, part of your career was like helping kill it, right, as a media columnist.
I think I saw what we were doing as CPR, but in retrospect, who knows?
All right, we're going to have a great guest today, Ken Auletta, who's been covering media since the 1990s, a journalist since the 1970s, and can give us a long view on how we've gotten here and where we go from here. All of that after the break. So, Ben, we've been away for a few weeks since season 1. How did you spend our hiatus?
Me, eating turkey and having kind of disappointing experiences with alternate social networks.
Oh, Blue Sky is not keeping you happy?
I don't know. So still, like we who were addicted to the old Twitter, so can always be kind of looking for that high again.
It's a very generous use of the past tense. I think you tweeted just moments ago, Ben, so I don't think you've given up on your addiction.
Possibly while we were recording. How about you?
Yes. I had a great Thanksgiving. I was with family. My sister escaped to Tokyo. I was with my mom. And since we've taped, I've done some traveling. I've also spent some time not in the kind of thick of newsroom cycle, which is nice. So I know you've had to run Semaphore, so you've been busy reporting out all these appointees. But I've been kind of working on some screen stuff and other projects that are a little bit more enterprise and away from it, which is nice. It's nice, Ben. It's like the whole culture is tuning out of news. If you haven't read like Washington Post headlines, the New York Times headline, everyone's like, the news, no thanks.
Yeah, I think it's slightly worrying for those of us in the news business, but I have a sense that Donald Trump's gonna keep the news pump primed.
Speaking of CPR. But anyways, it is season 2 of Mixed Signals, and we should explain to listeners what this season is going to be all about.
Yeah, last year on this show, and I think in media broadly, was this year of experiments and arguments about audience, about content, about where people were consuming and where they were being persuaded and where they were moving to. And frankly, I think it's pretty clear who won that argument, which was this new world of, that used to be called podcasts. Nayeema likes to say, every show is now just a show, but this new world of content.
They're creators. They've been around since the early 2010s, but somehow legacy media just woke up to their existence after this election.
Yeah, they finally just drove the stake into legacy media's heart this year. So I think we want to spend this season talking about, what the consequences are, what that means, what it means for where people consume media, how they consume it, but also fundamentally what it means for the business of media and what happens to these fragmented new independent YouTubers as, among other things, desperate legacy media companies that still have a lot of cash look to reassemble a bundle by, among other things, I suspect, starting to pull all these disparate voices back together.
Yeah, that's the weird moment of like super fragmentation in the industry, spin-offs at NBC Universal, and the idea of, we need consolidation. You're hearing David Zaslav say on these calls. And what you hope doesn't happen, I think, as a consumer is you don't want legacy media to just start buying them and giving them crazy margins and do what like A&E did to Vice. The ultimate end of that, it goes to a cable channel that nobody's watching and inflates an organization that was making really good content before the fact. I could see that being the future a little bit.
Yes, right. You could imagine a future in which the legacy media swallows and destroys everything that's good. You could
Yeah.
also imagine a world in which the legacy media takes its declining profit margins, but what is still a really effective ad sales operation in a lot of cases, and puts it across these new platforms in effective ways. I think it's very hard to predict actually what's going to happen, but I do think consumers are sick of paying for tons and tons of different subscriptions, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to figure out how to fix that.
Yeah, certainly there's a world in which, and I think a likely world in which it can be good for creators, good for advertisers, and bad for owners and investors of legacy media.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary.
Because the money will go to higher value, lower cost content that helps creators make more stuff.
It's a good thing we think of ourselves as creators here at Summit.
Do you think of yourself? I feel like we could be more creators. See, this is a great time to launch your own YouTube channel, Ben.
Yes.
You just need to grow your hair a little bit to the right, a little swoop, then you could do it.
Just gotta keep those production costs low and read more ads about green juice. I'm ready.
You're ready.
You're readier than I am, I think.
Yeah, I am ready for that. By the way, I do think that we cannot underestimate the role of the pandemic. I think a lot of this has been felt like it's right out of the election, but the truth is the pandemic did something that really hasn't been done in Hollywood and media, which is it changed consumers' expectations of what they could see. And this has traditionally been done by technological innovation. It has rarely been done by downscaling your expectations of production quality and content.
Yeah.
And I think that just created a huge boon for a kind of sitting ecosystem of content creators and also a new older generation of content creators to say, oh, now we're going to take our audio formats and put them on video and people are going to give us 3 hours of time. YouTube became TV in the real way.
Yeah, and it forced this kind of revolution in production as well that you don't see as much if you're not making it. But just the fact that we're sitting here talking to this miraculous software called Riverside.
Which doesn't let you hide self-view. My continuous gripe with
Yes,
Riverside.
forcing you to stare at your own face, but in every other way, perfect. It's really does again change the production side of media. The behind the camera part of media is sort of evaporating. There's nothing behind the camera here.
Yeah, so to kick off the season of Following the Money, we're going to talk to a legacy media expert, Ken Auletta, about where the media and the money goes from here. Ben, maybe give a little bit of bio on Ken.
Yeah, Ken Aletta was probably the first person I called up when I got the media column at the New York Times. He's been looking at the sort of sweep of media history, I think full time since the 90s, and when he started writing a column about it for the New Yorker, but for really longer than anyone else I know, and has been keeping really tightly plugged into these dramatic changes for just so long. He wrote the book about the disruption of broadcast television by cable in the 90s. It's called Three Blind Mice. Those were the three networks. And kind of stayed on that beat, wrote a biography of Ted Turner, and wrote a book in 2018 about the disruption of advertising by the tech platforms Google and Facebook called Frenemies.
Was that your favorite of his books, Ben?
The Michael Kasson stuff in there is great. Although my favorite of his books, I have to admit, is his wonderful book on the Koch administration called "The Streets Were Paved with Gold." If you're a New York City history buff.
And actually his recent book, I think it's his 13th book, and probably my favorite of the few books I've read. I haven't read all 13, and I haven't read the one on the Koch administration, so I'm clearly missing out.
Yeah, you're missing out.
But this one, The Hollywood Ending. Have you read this one?
Yes.
The Harvey Weinstein story, the Harvey Weinstein and the Culture of Silence. And this story is so fantastic because there were many books written about Harvey Weinstein. She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, and then obviously Ronan Farrow's book as well. And those were really about the journalism of the Harvey Weinstein story. This book is about the man, the kind of culture of power. It's its own kind of LBJ, Robert Caro-esque exploration of his psychology. And also the journalism of Ken having covered the industry and this person for so long and really, I think, doing a terrific job of exploring the power. He is a person who covers media, but he's really a person who covers power, which is really what media is about, right? Power and money.
Yep, at the top of every beat. But I do think that, as somebody who is just probably, since I started, been in an environment where people say the media is dying, I think it's nice sometimes to step back and say, what does that mean? What's the broader historical context for this? What's really happening here? And Ken's managed both to stay rooted in that history and stay very, very plugged into the technological moment.
So let's have Ken join us.
And by the way, we're talking to Ken in his Upper East Side apartment with some classic Upper East Side neighbor banging coming from upstairs, which you may occasionally hear.
That is true.
Thank you for doing this, Ken.
My pleasure.
I was sort of thinking about who could we're in this moment when everybody's sort of deploring the death of media, and of course you've been doing that for so long that I figure you could give us some of the sweep of it.
Fire away, pal.
Every time Ben and I have this conversation about the struggle of the media business, every time we go on someone else's podcast, every time we discuss it here or over drinks, Ben has this continuing refrain that the business has been dying since his whole career. His whole career, the business has been dying. Is this moment different to you after the election, this kind of write-up of the podcaster election, this spinoffs at NBC? Any indication that things are different?
Well, they are different. I mean, just look at the burst of podcasts and also right-wing media in the prominence they play. That's different. Does that mean that legacy media is terminal and dead? Not necessarily. I mean, we've been through those cycles many times before. I mean, I remember just a couple of years ago, people were saying that you have to be big to succeed at streaming. And yet I look at Hallmark and Tubi and other small streamers that are seemingly doing fairly well. And things change. And then you hear people talk about how you have to consolidate. Well, I remember back in 2000, the consolidation thing was AOL and Time Warner.
Great success.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious, just to begin with, if you put yourself in the head of the people running the big media companies right now, whether it's the new owners of CBS Viacom or the existing owners of NBC Universal. And I'm curious, what do you think they're thinking right now? How are the people with the perhaps declining, but still the biggest budgets, the biggest audiences, how are they looking at this landscape?
They're scared shit. They're scared as hell. And this has been true in the media world for a long time, in legacy media, where people are sitting there and they're wondering what is the right move to make. And they go back and they talk about consolidation, they talk about spinoffs, they talk about all these other things. But always they're looking at Apple and Google and Amazon and Facebook and saying, holy shit. And then you look at what NBC is doing now with MSNBC, and is that to prepare for a sale, or is it because they think that actually it will enhance the value of those? Or is it that plus a combination of just being scared shitless? I mean, just go back and think about newspapers at a time they're setting up the digital editions. And what did these people do? They put in charge of the digital edition someone from the legacy news. And they said you couldn't publish anything online until it appeared in the actual newspaper. I mean, it's insane. I mean, just totally insane. Well, they said to Google, take whatever you want. So you think about, these are people that were blind men trying to figure out where to go, and it's hard.
What should they have done in that moment? They have taken bloggers? Should they have, kind of done what Ezra Klein ended up being at Vox, stood up new news organizations around people who had grown up digitally native?
They should have actually hired digitally native people, not allow their editors from the newspaper to run the digital side, and do what Ben did and others have done later, which is get it out there. You have it, don't hold it, don't wait, saturate the market now and do it, and charge, and don't give it away.
Now, I wonder, just to sort of, think about these new forces. I was thinking, you wrote a book about Ted Turner in 2004, and he was a figure who really changed the direction of media with his own kind of force of will, appetite for risk, personality. I'm curious if you see anybody in this landscape who reminds you of that in this new moment. Is there a kind of Ted Turner figure swaggering around?
There is in the digital world. There are. Clearly, you can't talk about Page and Sergey Brin because they're not as deeply engaged, and I don't know whether the people who are engaged there have that kind of drive. But when I did my book on Google, which was 2009, and spent a lot of time on the Mountain View campus, they were clearly in the Ted Turner mold. I remember one meeting, I'm sitting, and I recorded this in the book. I'm sitting in a meeting with the engineers, and the challenge for them that Sergey and and Page had put forth is, I want people to get to a site when they click in a tenth of a second. They were doing it in 3/10 of a second. So they come in and they say, Larry, and Eric Schmidt was sitting between them. And they said, Larry and Sergey and Eric, it would be so expensive to get it down a tenth of a second. And it would take this difficulty. And do you really want to do that? I mean, and I'll never forget, Larry and Sergey Brin, in unison, they were almost speaking with one voice, and they say, that is not your job. You don't aim for the top of the trees. We're telling you to aim for the moon. And you come back here and tell us how you get to the moon. Don't tell us why you can't get to the moon. We know you can. And don't tell us what it will cost or the travels or the management issues involved. Just do it. And it was extraordinary. And that's something that was a Ted Turner-like moment, I thought.
What about, it also sounds Elon Musk-like, actually. Is he the Ted Turner of today?
Yeah, and they're both a little crazy and on the spectrum in some very fundamental way.
And have multiple wives.
Their EQ is questionable in both cases. I mean, their relationship to people. I'll never forget when I was doing the Turner profile, which started for the New Yorker. We were flying his plane, and so we went from New York. He had like a 727. He had a huge plane that he would fly on. And we went from New York to Atlanta at once. And he had a bed in the middle of the plane. And I'm sitting there with my notepad. And he gets into bed with his girlfriend. And I'm sitting right there. I'm saying, holy shit, what is going on? And that's someone who was not aware of his surroundings. He just did what he wanted to do.
That's really interesting. I never thought of Turner as the kind of antecedent to Elon Musk, but there really is something there, kind of
absolutely.
To the technological disruption and the will to power. Everybody talks about Hearst, but maybe it's Turner.
I keep on. My friend Walter Isaacson, who did that biography on Musk, I said, you watch Musk now with Trump and the crazy things he's done, and the almost 20% of all the money that Trump raised in the campaign came from Musk, and he calls him my bruh, my pal, best pal, and all that. I said, is he different, Walter? Has he changed, or has he always been a little? And he says, always been a little. He doesn't see a fundamentally different Musk, even though I do.
Right. Others who cover him would say that he did change. I think certainly, we did an interview with Elon Musk at the early days of COVID in fall of 2020, and there was a significant difference I think COVID changed him a lot in the sense that he really wanted to keep his factories open. He wanted to hear what Jay Bhattacharya had to say on Twitter. He wanted to have a conversation, and it created this strange kind of union, a Silicon Valley movement for free speech.
Right. Like what I was saying about Google, he very much is in that. He said, you will do it in 9 months. The Tesla slept on the factory floor. I mean,
yes, exactly.
Very consistent with those guys. But that was Steve Jobs, too.
Yeah. There's this lionization of how you have to behave if you work in these fields. I remember when I worked with Jason Kyler, there was an early conversation we had about Jeff Bezos and kind of, well, Jeff did things like this. And I think there's a, emulation of a kind of attitude toward the business.
Right.
Which happens. But Elon Musk, how do you look at his impact on media? If he is the next Ted Turner, then what is the next phase of media like? He has a 200 million megaphone, that he's using to support presidential candidates or draw attention to right-wing podcasters or, the Babylon Bee, as it were.
It's a really provocative question because you think about media moguls, and I think about, Hearst and Luce or Beaverbrook or the Janes in India, or Hegelberg in Germany in Hitler's time. I mean, they were dominant usually in one industry, newspapers, and in one country. Murdoch has been dominant on 3 continents and in multiple industries. And now suddenly, as you're suggesting, along comes Musk with 205 million followers and the money and his relationship with the president of the United States, and his interest in cutting $2 trillion from the budget, which will affect some of his competitors potentially, and the conflicts of interest there. And you say, well, isn't he a bigger media mogul than any of these other guys?
It's kind of been fashionable in media to write Twitter off, to say it's dead, to say it's, is it actually the thing that's going to replace television networks? Like, do you think this notion of Twitter as, whatever Musk is fumbling toward as this particularly platform for video content, which is how people consume, do you think that's a real serious rival to Fox, I guess, particularly?
I mean, it could be. Certainly, it could be to a cable Fox News a rival for that. But I don't. He seems so impulsive, and I mean, look at him firing all those people when he came to Twitter, and then needing some of them to come back, and decimating his advertising business, which was his revenue stream. So I don't know. I mean, I remember Ted Turner when he knew he had to sell ads, and he would go and he would literally lie down on the floor of Brian Roberts' father to try and sell Comcast ads for Turner, But he never took his eye off the ball that I could do crazy things, but I have to be nice to the potential advertisers because that's my sole source of income. And I don't know that what's his name.
Elon. He did show up at DealBook last year, and try his very best, but he's hard to contain himself. It seems, but certainly Twitter, in many ways, replaced the front page, I would say.
Yeah, I would love to see someone do an interview with Linda Yaccarino, who he recruited as CEO, and how
that's actually going.
I mean, he says, I don't care about advertisers. We don't need that. I mean, that's what she does. I mean,
yeah, but Ken, after this election, the advertisers are back. They're all coming back to X. It's I think the pendulum has shifted.
Yeah.
But actually, let's take a quick break right now, and when we come back, let's talk more about the advertising business.
This week on our branded segment from Think with Google, I spoke with Google's VP of Marketing, Josh Spanier, about how measurement became a change agent. So there's a lot of talk about the art and science of marketing, and most of what we consumers think about is the art. We see the ads, we hear the ads, billboards, celebrity endorsements. What are the latest developments in the science of marketing?
So if you want to be a modern marketer, if you want to be a progressive marketer, you got to be able to speak the language of the chief financial officer. You got to show accountability. You got to show incrementality, that your campaigns did something that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't done it. So we have invested as an industry massive amounts of energy into data and data science and something called media mix models and match market tests. And it's all pretty complicated, but it's all so we can actually show that our art actually pays off and delivers outcomes that businesses can actually use to drive their growth.
That is notoriously difficult. Do you think marketers are doing it well?
I think a lot of marketers are doing it really, really well. And actually, there's a huge collection of great materials you can read about. If you go to thinkwithgoogle.com and search Data Foundations for Growth, we've just published a whole collection across advertisers and across technologies of how you can actually drive business outcomes if you're a practitioner, a CMO, or just someone who's interested in the topic.
And are there, in your own experience at Google, are there campaigns, are there wins in your world that you'd point to in this regard?
There absolutely are, but let me tell you about a challenge that every marketer faces, which is how do you run the optimal mix of ads on any platform to drive the best outcome? So let's take YouTube, for example. So on YouTube, we've been experimenting to understand the formula which drives the best business outcomes for our campaigns. And what we've actually learned is that when you have creators, people who make content for the platform, actually make ads on our behalf, and we marry that with our own creative made by our agencies, the combination of creator assets and brand assets is driving 50 to 70% uplifts in performance. It's really exciting to see YouTube work as well as it is. It's already a strong platform. Now we're really experimenting and learning through measurement to make it even better.
And there's some alchemy of creator, brand, long, short, vertical, horizontal that you're measuring?
we are absolutely measuring all of it. We're measuring it top to bottom. This is how we're able to persuade the CFO to invest marketing budgets and to give us more resources to actually drive business outcomes. It's complicated, but it's also really fascinating and really fun.
All right. Well, we in media are all for that. Good luck with the CFO. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Ben.
So Ken, your 12th and next to last book was about the $2 trillion ad business called Frenemies. And that is the business that props up the biggest tech companies, props up the media, including us. And I wanted to read just a line from your intro, which was that you talked about how you've recorded for 3 decades on the digital hurricane that swept across the media industry. You wrote, "I've tried to follow the money, to understand the source of the economic harm that struck newspaper, magazines, TV, and radio, all reeling from shrinking ad revenue now fueling Google, Facebook, and a myriad of other digital enterprises." And I'm curious how you see that business, the ad business, adapting to this new landscape of creators, of fragmentation, of this decisive shift to digital. How do you see the ad business adapting?
Well, the big ad agencies, like the big legacy media companies, have shrunk and been assailed by smaller competitors. I mean, I think about someone like Gary Vaynerchuk, a brilliant digital advertising guy. He's built a very successful small company that steals their business. So when Chase wanted to sell, its new credit card, they didn't go to one of the big companies. They went to Gary Vaynerchuk, and so some of the same disruption we've seen in traditional media, you see in advertising. The other issue becomes the lack or the decrease in funding from advertising per se newspapers. And once the New York Times received 80% of its revenues from advertising, now it receives something closer to 20 or 30% of its revenues from advertising. And one of the things I wrote in that book, and I don't know whether it's going to be correct in the long run, I said the assumption that subscriptions will replace advertising is a very frail assumption to make, because people don't have that kind of disposable income to be able to. I mean, I look at all the things I subscribe to, and I say, it's insane. I mean, I actually lose track. Not just the streamers, but all the websites I'm paying for, and I have a little more cushion to spend. But you think about the average person spending, it's really tough. And that's why what people like you do at Semaphore, you create events. Some people say Graydon Carter's selling merchandise. I mean, you're trying to desperately figure out, how do I get some revenue in, because I can't rely on advertising the same way.
And if you are a marketer looking across that, as you say, totally fragmented landscape where everybody's listening to a different podcast, following a different creator on a different platform, how are they approaching it? I mean, how do they punch through?
Well, one of the things they do, and this is a great strength that the digital companies have, they look at who has data that I can make a more efficient sale. I want to be able to target, so I don't waste money on advertising. I want to be able to target people who have bought Ford cars or might be interested in a Ford truck. And so that's an advantage that digital companies, the biggest advantage is Amazon's advantage, because they have data on who actually has bought things. And so if you look at advertising growth, the digital companies, the one that's growing the fastest is Amazon, because they have that amazing data that the advertise. But what does that portend for the legacy media companies? It's really much more of a problem.
Well, they're going to get squeezed out, it sounds like.
They can't offer the data.
Yeah, and also, by the way, nor can podcasters, right? Like podcasters don't even have a Nielsen actually trackability and advertising. There's probably a great business to be created to make podcasts like much more trackable, affiliate fees, and certainly you can scale and fund, the production value of a lot of these kind of YouTube shows, et cetera, through some subscriptions. Like Patreon has allowed that, Kickstarter has allowed that, and YouTube Ad Share plus brand sponsorships allow that.
I kind of have faith in the innovative nature of the advertising industry to find a way to get some sponsorship in there.
But see, then you get another thing. When we have a choice in streaming, it, it, I never opt for ads. I can't stand, and I think we're being spoiled. People are spoiled, and get fatigued with ads. We don't want ads anymore, and so that's a real challenge to the advertising world. The clutter. If you watch CNN, actually, one day I got to time it. I watch CNN. I turn on at 4 o'clock for Jake Tapper. I think and I go when I cut up, I'm cooking or something, and I go and I watch Jake Tapper, and every 4 or 5 minutes, I'm interrupted by ads that last 4 or 5 minutes. And it seems to me it's not the 19 minutes an hour. It's more than that.
And you
Right.
can't skip them the way you can on YouTube.
Yeah.
No, I do think
No.
people are trained now to be totally horrified by the ad load on TV and by how clunky it is. It's a big
Right.
problem.
But my argument is they're not trained. They've been spoiled
Yeah.
because they can watch streaming without ads. But follow the logic. It's very good logic. If you follow the logic, you say that really is a challenge to the advertising world, that maybe they will be diminished by this.
Or they'll find ways to weave sponsorships deeper into the programming. You know, Jake Tapper is going to be, you know, sipping that Starbucks coffee or whatever.
Or I do think that the advertising industry, though, is in some ways quite nimble. I don't know about every individual that's making these decisions, but in like AI, we talk about, well, the oldest form of AI, the first forms, is the algorithm, right? And advertisers certainly were able to figure out how to play in that world and SEO. And they have created the 6-second ad spot in a sense that the attention economy has really befuddled television programmers. It hasn't in the same way the advertising industry. We're going to do brand integrated sponsorships. We're not going to chase Michelle Kwan, the biggest beauty influencer. We're going to do deals with, 10 people with 30,000 followers each because the money will move faster. So I do think there's this kind of agility in the advertising industry. But then there are these kind of like old relationships that keep money, even in political advertising, like going to these big political ad buys without much ROI, probably.
Well, you see, I think one of the things you highlight for me is there are two types of people. There are people who lean forward and people who lean back. And the people who succeed, it seems to me, particularly in a world of such change we're living, are those who lean forward and say, how do I do things differently? I'm not going to be wedded to what I've always done. I got to figure out a different way of doing, be you in advertising or streaming or newspapers, whatever.
It is interesting, though, to the degree. I mean, as Nayeema just said, and I think it's sort of core to your books on Google and on advertising, the degree to which this whole AI revolution was underwritten by ad tech and by by Meta and Google in particular, pouring so much research money into that came out of ad dollars into these things that are going to deeply disrupt that business.
And that in turn was underwritten by all the free content that, the New York Times and others were happy to provide these organizations, and BuzzFeed and others were happy to provide these organizations.
But one of the things that struck me when I was doing a Google book and living out there a good amount of time is the engineer culture was one that said, we're in the disruption business. We don't give a shit about publishing, the publishers, whether we're hurting them. We're giving the reader and the user, the customer, something totally different. So when I'm at Google and I say, I want to look at how you're digitizing books. And they say, great. So I go down and I had free reign. They were very cooperative with me. So I go down and the head of digital sales, and he has his team there. And they show me, they say, let us show you how cool this is. And they put up one of my books. And they say, see, you could read any chapter for free, anything you want. And you could just go and you could search. And I'm saying, oh, really? That's very interesting. And as soon as I got out of that meeting, I called my publisher. I said, these guys are stealing work. But they didn't see it that way. It was fair use to them. It wasn't stealing. It was something that wasn't it great for the consumer? I mean, what about the maker? What about the writer? And they didn't think that way. And that's always a problem with the engineer mentality and out there. How do we disrupt? And they take pride in that, but they don't think about the jobs that people are going to get laid off.
But Ken, do you think the big news organizations think about that either? It's down to investors and their top line. They're not really concerned about the creators of their content. And certainly if they do these, like, start acquiring podcasters, they're not going to be terribly concerned about the happiness of their consumers. That's going to be a tension between like creators and these big companies.
But the disruption brought about by the digital giants is so much larger. That's all I'm saying. And they actually sell it as a virtue. I mean, when the newspaper lays off people, they're sad. What I would hear from the Google and the Apples and these guys is we're virtuous. Isn't this wonderful what we're doing? There was no apology. They didn't think about victims at all. So I don't know. I was just struck by that.
Yeah.
So what are you leaning? You said, success comes to those who lean forward. So maybe as a last question, what are you leaning forward into? We see that you lean back from Twitter. You haven't tweeted since 2009.
I don't tweet.
But you must follow.
Yeah, not really. I don't really spend any time with Twitter or Facebook. Never have.
So what do you lean into?
I'm doing a documentary, which I've never done before. I'm doing Matt Tynauer, who just did The Carvel, and he did Where's My Roy Cohn. He's really very good. And
very good.
Our other partner is Radical Media, which is done.
They're fantastic.
Yeah,
I came up as a documentary filmmaker before I was a video journalist, so that's great.
We're doing a Murdoch doc.
On Murdoch, huh? How does that story end?
I'm going to keep my lip zippered up, and I'm still reporting, so I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by talking about it. But it's obviously a rich story.
Can you say where the story starts? Because I thought one of the things that you did so beautifully in the Harvey Weinstein book was it was about the journalism, which a couple of books had been about, but it was also about the character and kind of how you built that up. So where do you start the Rupert Murdoch story?
Well, I think you go back to a guy who, first of all, the relationship between the son and the father is very important. Rupert revered his father. He was 21 years old and an Oxford student, and an angry student with a bust of Lenin on his wall, Rupert Murdoch. And his father died. And he rushes home and he finds out that the business, he thought he was inheriting a giant company. His father was basically an employee, the most famous journalist in Australia, but he didn't own the newspapers he ran. He had a piece of them. And Rupert came back and felt like it was stolen from him. So he set out to subjugate the people who stole his father's business. And he did so in Australia and became this mighty mogul.
What a business this is, right? Ego and technology and Shakespearean family drama.
But Ben, on that point, one of the things that's fascinating, if you have the luxury of time to report, is you find that people who you think are very logical and trained often make decisions for very human reasons. For instance, to give you one example, in 1994, I profiled John Malone, who was then the most powerful cable.
Then as now.
He's still super powerful and underspoken about
actually,
now. Yeah.
I find his brain processing power probably greater than anyone I've interviewed, including Bill Gates. I mean, he's just really smart. In any case, he had sold his TCI, his cable business, for like $34 billion to a telephone company, Bell Atlantic. And everyone is saying, why John Malone sell? Well, $34 billion, And I assumed that was true. And I'm sitting in his office, and I noticed at 12 o'clock, he didn't have a phone on his desk. You hear a phone ringing, and he opens up a drawer, he pulls out a red phone, and he says, "Yes, dear, I'll be right there." He hangs up. And then at 5 o'clock, same thing happens. "Yes, dear, I'll be right there." So the second day, I'm sitting in his office, fly on the wall, and the same thing happens. And I said, "Mr. Malone, what is this 'yes, dear' and the phone? What are you doing?" He says, "My wife, I meet her for lunch every day at 12 o'clock. And I said, "What about the call at 5 o'clock? He said, "I meet her, we go to the gym together." So in a subsequent interview, maybe later that same day, I said, and I had no suspicion I would get a different answer. I said, "So why did you sell TCI? And he said, well, it was a great price, $34 billion. I said, and innocently, I said, was there any other reason that you sold? And he then startled me by saying, yes, my wife said she would leave me because I'm never there. I'm always traveling unless I get rid of the company.
But, we asked Bob Iger why he didn't run for president. And he said, my wife said it could be anything I wanted, but she wouldn't necessarily be my wife anymore.
Yeah, I know he says that, but I remember having a session with him. I know him from
Of
when I
course,
did,
yeah.
and he wanted to run, but he couldn't figure out how to do it. And he was talking about hiring PR and strategists and stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure Willow Bay, his wife, had something to say, but he was in way over his head.
She's a scapegoat. The women are always a scapegoat. Well, Ken, this has been great talking to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us in the early days of Elon Musk's media empire before we're all gobbled up.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Ken.
You guys are good. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
I love those Ted Turner stories. Who knew?
It's so interesting. Such a huge figure who really changed everything about media and was a lunatic.
The girlfriend climbed into the bed while Ken Aletta was there. I mean,
this is a man we do not talk about enough, Ted Turner. Or you're like, maybe it is enough. Maybe it is enough.
Yeah.
There is something about these egomaniacs who don't play by any rules, who love media most of all, because of course, like, it puts the spotlight back on you, who play these huge outside roles in these sort of technological revolutions in media. Probably across business, but certainly in media.
Media has more vanity investing, so it allows for more
exactly.
ego, right? But what's really funny in that is the conversation we just had with Ken is revelatory in the sense that, like, the power isn't with, I don't know, these moguls of media empires. It's often with the advertisers that are funding their big enterprises, or it's with the technology companies who, are distributing it for them. So Joe Malone remains probably the most interesting, non-talked about, powerful person in the industry.
Yeah, that's totally right. And then the sort of And I think right now, it's so obvious that Musk is the dominant and sort of most interesting, most powerful media figure of this moment. And I do think this question that you raised about, is advertising going to absolutely flow back to X, even if it's not maybe every advertiser's favorite environment, partly for political reasons, partly because maybe they care less about brand safety. I don't know. I mean, I think that'll be a really interesting question for this year.
I mean, they are showing up, and I think they'll go where the eyeballs are. Hard time to be a media executive, good time to be a creator or an advertiser in some. But Ken Aletta, sobering to talk to him, puts it all in context.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because he's somebody, right, who has covered the sort of sweep of media disruption starting in the 80s. And you do really get the sense that right now, more than at any other time, these legacy companies are on their heels, are scared, so scared, and the tech platforms remain in a really dominant position, negotiating these huge technical changes that they've themselves created and disrupted themselves. But at this point, if you are like NBC, you're just clinging with your fingernails to this whole thing.
Yeah, well, or maybe, if you're in the New York Times, you're kind of innovating constantly. You're leaning forward into games, cooking, et cetera, which I think they've just done a really good job on. And he was very complimentary of you at Semaphore and the events business, et cetera.
I'll take it, whatever we can get. But I think it's in a way we're sort of nearing the end of this very long period that he started out covering in the golden age of broadcast.
Do we think his movie is going to be a cheeseburger, to use Netflix language?
I mean, there's a lot of fun stuff in the life of Rupert Murdoch. It's not all just power politics. So hopefully it'll be pretty entertaining.
And that Roy Cohn documentary was great. So I think I will be watching. I will be watching and hopefully reading if he writes about it. All right, that's it for our show today. Thanks for listening to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani and Sheena Izaki, with special thanks to Max Toomey, Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Our engineer is Rick Kwan. Our theme music is by Billy Libby. Our public editor is who this week, Ben?
It's my colleague Shihab Mesrook, on whose computer I'm recording this show.
Who has given you his computer for the last couple hours because you took the wrong tennis bag to work this morning.
It's true.
We might want to be asking why you're taking tennis bags to work, Ben, but
I mean, that 6 a.m. court.
I guess the business really is over, or it's just booming and you're playing tennis.
6 a.m. Nayeema, working hard.
All right. If you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts and feel free to review us. And if Max Tani were here, he will be here next time. We miss you, Max. He would say?
He would remind you to sign up for our media newsletter, which comes out every Sunday night and breaks quite a bit of news about the chaos in this industry.